again, I think the confusing things, the confounding things for people is they tend to just think of HRV as this workout tool or measurement, but it's not. It's measuring this output of everything. It's literally a reflection of what is your lifestyle doing to your body. Is the way to look at it. When you see big variations, it means that your lifestyle is causing a lot of stress in the body. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it can recover from that and it's able to do it in a productive way. But if it's swinging all over the place, chances are it's not recovering from it. You do want, again, like I said, a fair amount of stability in that, but that really depends on the system that you're using. But yeah, it's not just workout equals hard equals low HRV. It doesn't work that way. There's just so many overlapping influences. You've got people are often shocked at how much alcohol impacts them, how much a poor night of sleep impacts them, how much a day of stress at work impacts them, how much, all of these things add up. They're cumulative. They're not separate individual buckets that you can quantify. They're all overlapping. They all impact the body because they're all impacting that autonomic nervous system, and they're all a form of stress in the body.
Hi, I'm Lauren Parsons.
And I'm Andy Jackson, and this is the All Well Co podcast.
Dive deep with us as leading experts share their unique perspectives on topics such as recovery, sleep, movement, and the latest innovations in the space.
Well, Joel, it's a pleasure to have you on the All Well Co podcast. You are an expert in HRV, and we'll get into that in a second, but could you give us a brief overview of your background and the sort of pivotal role in bringing HRV into the mainstream of, fitness, sports, health monitoring?
Sure. I mean, I would say first and foremost, I consider myself a coach. I've been coaching for 20 plus years now. Started doing it really in the early 2000s at the University of Washington and then the Seahawks, and I opened up my own gym. And very early in that process, I was introduced to HRV, and it was really the first commercial HRV system that was ever built that was designed for fitness use. It was developed by the Russians, actually. And at the time, it was this $35,000 system. It was very obviously expensive. It was a laptop that required you to do a full ECG. It was cumbersome. It just gave you lots and lots of data points. It kind of left it up to you to figure out what that meant. But it was really my introduction to understanding the world of what happens to people outside the gym after they've done a workout, and the introduction to me of what HRV is, how it works, how important it is, and all that sort of stuff. So over the last 20 years, once I recognized what HRV was doing and how important it was to me as a coach, and because it really helped unlock that black box, which we can talk about. And I really just recognized that there was a need for it beyond, what I was doing in the gym, and more coaches and people needed to have access to this because it was so vital. And so I developed my own HRV system first back in 2011. And then more recently in 2018, the next evolution of that called Morpheus, which we'll obviously talk about. But my whole career has really been trying to understand, how do you help people reach their goals like any other coach, and the system of HRV, the technology behind it, what it's doing has played a pivotal role in that. I've been able to coach a lot of world champions in combat sports. I've worked with teams across many different disciplines across the globe, really. I've done some consulting in Japan and Australia and the UK and China and kind of all over the place as this need for technology has evolved. And I've focused on recovery, regeneration, conditioning, because that's really what the heart of HRV allows you to do. So it's been a long journey. It's been awesome to be able to take this technology that at one point no one had any clue of what it was and see it become what it is today, where it's on people's Apple Watches, whether they know what it is or not. And it's obviously everywhere in comparison to where it started. So it's been a fun journey, and that's the big story.
So Joel, did it start in sports? Is that where it came from?
No, I mean, originally, so if you really want to go back, I mean, they've known, when I say they, I mean, scientists and doctors have recognized that there's a variability in the heart rate pattern for centuries. They recognized the heart didn't beat like a metronome a long time ago. They didn't really understand what that meant. But it was really as far back from my knowledge of the Russians using it to measure the effects of space on cosmonauts. And so they were able to get that signal from space, basically the heart rate signal, and they were able to break it down into its components to look at heart rate variability. And to me, that's the first like real novel use of it in a practical and powerful, interesting way. And then kind of the 60s, 70s, it was researched for various purposes in the medicine side of things, telemedicine, space medicine, all that. And then the Russians were the first ones in the 80s to begin development on the platform for sport performance. And really before they could finish it, the Soviet Union crumbled. And so it didn't really go to completion until these same group of scientists met about 10, 12 years later at a track meet actually in Portland, or actually Eugene, Oregon, from what I was told. And they resurrected that program and built the first, like I said, commercial use HRV system that was designed for fitness and coaches. But it's also been researched, in the last 20, 30 years in medicine. It's used in a variety of uses around that and has hundreds and hundreds of papers, thousands of papers really around different elements of it. It's been used in everything from obviously sport performance to psychology to just a wide range of cardiac medicine, prognostic, cardiac rehabilitation, just all kinds of stuff like that. So it's broad. It's been around a long time. It's not a new thing. It's just new to the consumers.
Yeah. For our listeners who might be new to the topic, could you explain what heart rate variability, or HRV, is and why it's important?
Sure. I mean, it's a complicated topic, but the easiest way to understand it is you have to start with this concept of stress, because HRV is so fundamental to that. Now, most people, when they think of stress, they just think of something like a mental stressor. They're stressed out from work, or they're stressed out from family, or whatever the case may be. But the reality is stress is just this interaction between our body and the world around us. And we could define a stressor as really anything that interacts and causes our body to have to react to it. And that reaction happens through what's called the autonomic nervous system, which is central to understanding heart rate variability. And people have probably heard of this. They've heard of at least the components of it. You've got two branches. One, you've got the sympathetic, and that's what we always hear of as the fight or flight side of things. And then we have the parasympathetic system, which people often hear as the rest and digest. And it's that autonomic nervous system that really has two main roles. One, it has to keep our body running at all points in time and make sure that our body has the energy that it needs to function, and it directs where the energy goes. So if we need to do something that requires more energy, that sympathetic system, we call a stress response system, turns up energy system so that we can meet the demands. And then once that is passed, and once we're done with that, then the parasympathetic system kicks on and turns everything back down to normal and restores the body to the way it was and directs energy towards regeneration, repair, all those sorts of things. Now, people tend to unfortunately think of these like a switch, like you're in fight or flight or you're not. It's not really a good way to think about it. These are both dials. So as I turn on that stress response, I have a range of how far that dial can turn. And the easiest way to see this for the average person just sitting there is you can just look at your heart rate as you get up and move around the room versus sitting down. Or you go to a workout, your heart rate is increasing because that sympathetic nervous system is increasing energy production because you're doing something that's stressful in the body. Now, after that, we sit down, we lay down, we see our heart rate come back down. Well, that's the parasympathetic system turning on to bring everything back down to where it was beforehand and facilitate the body restoring itself back to normal. So it's that interaction between those two systems that brings about heart rate variability. In particular, what we're looking at is the interaction of that parasympathetic nervous system, that rest and digest system, on the cardiac system, on the heart itself, because that nerve, it's called the vagus nerve, it innervates the heart. And it intersects with that and causes this variability because it doesn't constantly put this input into the heart. It's a pulse-like input. So as you breathe out, the parasympathetic system turns on, basically. As you breathe in, the parasympathetic system is inhibited. And so as you breathe out, as you exhale, your parasympathetic system slows your heart rate down just slightly. And then as you inhale, your heart rate speeds up just slightly. And so that creates variability. If we look at the pattern of the heart rate, it's in rhythm with our respiratory system for a few different reasons. So we don't see the heart beating like a metronome. We see the heart beating in a variable pattern depending on how much activity there is of that parasympathetic nervous system. When that parasympathetic nervous system is more active, we see it slowing down more with each exhalation and speeding up more with each inhalation. When it's less active, we see the opposite of that. We see less variability. So it's measuring how active that parasympathetic system, rest, digest, repair system is on our body. And that tells us a whole lot about how much our body has been exposed to stress, how well our body is able to recover and adapt and respond to that stress, and just gives us a very big picture of how dynamic our body is in its ability to respond and recover and adapt to the world around us, which turns out to be a hugely important thing for health and wellness. So I know it's kind of a long definition, but to really understand it, you have to understand the concept of stress, recovery, and these two branches, the autonomic nervous system, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic, because those are at the heart of what HRV is and why it's so important.
Yeah, and there's often confusion between heart rate versus heart rate variability. You've mentioned it in your definition, but could you delineate the difference between the two a little bit more?
Sure. I mean, heart rate's the easiest one. It's just literally how many times a minute your heart's beating, right? So if we say your heart rate's 60, we're talking about in a minute, it's beating 60 times. But again, if your heart rate was 60 beats per minute, your heart wasn't beating just exactly 1 time per second, like it would if it was a metronome. It's constantly speeding up and slowing down, and that average would be 60. But if we were to actually look at that pattern, we would not see this very metronome-like distributed pattern. How variable it was from 1 second to the next would depend on that parasympathetic nervous system. And a higher variability means your heart rate would vary. If you were measuring instantaneously, it could be 65 beats per minute down to 55 beats per minute if you were measuring instantaneously, if that makes sense. So the more variability, the more distributed that pattern of heart rhythm would be, the higher HRV we would say that you have. But the heart rate itself is just the output. The HRV is what's driving that output because it's impacting the rhythm of the heart that leads to that output, as well as other variables. The heart itself and its morphology. So if you have a bigger left ventricle that can squeeze out more blood, your resting heart rate's lower. But we will still see differences in heart rate variability across any heart rate that you might have, because again, that parasympathetic nervous system is always active and playing a role when you're at rest, at least, in measuring or impacting the heart rate itself. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
So you mentioned, it's been used in space, it's used with athletes, etc. But you take someone like myself, I measure my HRV most days. The reason why I started doing it is that I had some heart issues last year. I found out I got atrial fibrillation. My father had had a stroke, so I was at an increased risk of it, and I ended up having an ablation. I actually wear a loop monitor here just to check all of that out. I felt this made sense for me to look at my heart rate variability. And obviously, I'm using it to get consistency in my health metrics. So why is greater variability in HRV seen then as a positive indicator?
Yeah, so we have to kind of talk about HRV in two separate contexts for that to make sense. Because as you mentioned, you kind of think, stability is a good thing, and variability seems like something that's not as good. And the reality is, we look at HRV from both a day-to-day variation, and we look at HRV from an average standpoint. And people have differing levels of both, and they mean different things. So if we look at your average HRV, and this is important to understand that the systems that we use can measure HRV very differently. This is a really important point, actually. HRV is really just a framework for measuring this variability, this input of the parasympathetic nervous system. But there are many different ways to calculate it. There's a wide range of actual calculations that spit out an HRV number. The most common one used these days is called RMSSD, and that gives you a number in milliseconds. But different systems can measure and calculate HRV differently. So it's important, if when I give a number or we talk about HRV, we're talking about the concept. But if you're measuring it, one system, Apple Watch, for example, uses what's called SDNN. It's a totally different number. Morpheus uses our own system we've developed over time that uses RMSSD, but then does some math to it to make it a little bit more digestible as a number. So when I'm talking about higher, you can't compare what I'm saying to what particular system you're using. But in general, higher HRV on average means that your body is capable of responding to more stress, because your body has greater ability to turn that stress off with that parasympathetic nervous system in general. We have greater capacity to respond to the stress of the world around us because that parasympathetic system can turn off and it can adapt to the world around us more easily. If we have very low variability, it means that parasympathetic system is not functioning very well, which means our ability to, again, respond and recover and regenerate and adapt to the world around us is diminished. And as we age, we lose heart rate variability. It's just a natural byproduct of aging, but we can slow down that decline as we can with many things through fitness and lifestyle. So on average, higher HRV just means we have greater capability to respond to the world around us, and that leads to greater health. Now, if we're talking about a daily standpoint, our HRV is constantly fluctuating based on what we're doing to ourselves and what happens. So as we go through an intense day of workout, mental stress, whatever the case may be, that will drop our HRV down a bit because our body's using that sympathetic system to produce energy for that day. Then we want our parasympathetic system to turn up HRV to, again, recover, regenerate, and get ourselves back to normal. So HRV is going to bounce up. And these are just the result of many overlapping influences. HRV is influenced by literally everything you do: sleep, diet, nutritional interventions like supplements, alcohol, training, mental stress, all of this stuff is impacting HRV. Now, in this case, if we see huge variations, it tells us our body is under a lot of stress. That's not necessarily a good thing. If we see more stability in that, that actually is a good thing. So it's kind of a weird thing to say, but you want, generally speaking, some amount of stability in your variability, which again sounds kind of confusing, but what you don't want is an HRV just bouncing all over the place with huge swings up and down. That just tells us that our body's under a lot of stress and it's having to respond to that, which will have a toll on ourselves, take a toll on ourselves over time. So again, just big picture, in the long run, we want a higher average. In the short run, we do want more stability in that number. We don't want it skyrocketing one day and tanking the next day and repeating that pattern, because that's just a reflection of how much stress we're putting our body under. So hopefully that makes some sense, even though it does sound funny to say we want stability in our variability, but we actually do.
Well, one of the new features we're adding to this podcast is we're starting to ask our network members about the topic that we're going to actually talk about. So one of the questions we got a few times around this HRV is that sometimes there's a discrepancy where the HRV is high, but what they call the readiness score is low. So can you explain what factors could, contribute to that? Because that seems, contrary.
Yeah. So again, to really understand that, we have to take just an isolated stressor and talk about what happens. Okay, we'll use a workout because that's probably the thing most people are doing and are more familiar with how they would expect it to react. So let's say I start with, I'm just going to use a number, just so you kind of have a baseline. Let's say I wake up in the morning, I use Morpheus, which is my system, which we can talk about, and your HRV is, let's say, 80, which is a good HRV score on our scale. It's somewhat similar to a 0 to 100 scale. 80, 90, 100 is very good. So let's say you wake up your morning and it's 80, okay? Now, I go through a very hard workout. My HRV is going to drop because I've activated that stress response system, that fight or flight system, to a fairly high degree. So if I was to measure my HRV immediately after workout, which we wouldn't do, it would drop significantly. It could drop down to, let's say, 60, for example. And that just reflects, I just did a hard workout. My HRV is down because my body created all this energy for the stressor, and my body's still going through the after effects of that. Now, at some point, my body's going to turn that dial of that sympathetic system down, and it's going to tilt the other direction. It's going to turn the dial up of that parasympathetic system because my body has to restore everything. We can also think about these people apart, anabolic and catabolic. The sympathetic system, the stress response system, is more catabolically driven activities. The parasympathetic system is more anabolically driven activities. It's storing energy versus breaking it down. So as my body turns up that parasympathetic nervous system, at some point, particularly in people that are well trained, it's going to go above that baseline. So let's say I was 70, it's going to go up to maybe 75, 76, or I think I said 80, sorry. It'll go up to 80, 85. It'll go above where I started because it needs to put more energy into that repair. It'll go higher. And then once it's gone through the whole process, it'll recover back down to where it started, around 80. So you see this curve where it's suppressed, and then it raises and it goes up above where it started, and then it comes back down to normal as it's completed the process. And that's what like a single stress would look like if you could look at it in a longitudinal fashion. You could see it all points in time. Now, again, because HRV reflects everything else, you don't always see that clean of a pattern, but that's what would happen. So in that case, if my HRV is way above my baseline, it's just telling me on that daily basis, I'm still going through that process. My body has not completed this full cycle of stress recovery back to normal. It's still on the tail end of that. It hasn't come back down. So again, when we talk about long-term HRV, average higher is better. On short-term, way above your average doesn't mean it's better. It means it's still going through this recovery process. It's just the other side of it, if that makes sense. So if you want to complete the whole process, the HRV has to come back to where your normal average is. And again, the amount of variability depends on the system you're using. Some systems, it might be 30 points on the scale, and Morpheus, it might be 4 or 5. Like, it really depends on the system that you're using. But again, you have to just understand the context of how this would work. If you were to look at just one isolated thing, that's what would happen. It would come down, it would go above baseline, and it would come back down to normal. And there's also, again, variability in the amount of time it takes for these things to happen. There's variability in how much it's going to go up versus down, depending on your genetics and your fitness levels. There's lots of things to look at here, but that's the fundamental reason why sometimes you'll see a higher HRV and you think, oh, my HRV's up, that's good. But if it's way above what it normally is, that's not necessarily good. That's just an indication that your body hasn't completed the entire process yet.
So the way I'm doing it, you can correct me if I'm not doing it right. The most important thing to me is my morning readiness. I just repeat it. That's when I do it. I just want to see how am I in the morning. I've woken up. I normally do it within 2 hours of getting up. Sure, I might have had a cup of coffee, but I generally haven't done a lot of exercise. I haven't done a lot of things then. And sometimes I'll wake up and my score 10 is supposedly the best number on this system I'm using. And then, one time it will be 3 and it will be in the sympathetic side. And the next time it will be 5 on the, is that just a result of what I did the day before, or it's cumulative of what I've done in the week?
Yeah,
What's happening with my readiness score?
Sure, it's cumulative. I mean, it's going to reflect the last 24 to 48 hours, generally to some extent. It's obviously the more immediate, it's going to have more weight in that. But yeah, it's reflecting the process that your body's gone through over the last day or two. I mean, if you did 2 days in a row of very intense work, it's going to be different if you just did 1 day of very intense work. It's going to probably have a bigger impact because you've done that for 2 days or 3 days or whatever. It's accumulation of those things. But of course, it's just showing you how your body is, again, swinging both directions. If it's in the sympathetic realm, it's produced more energy, it's more catabolic, it's in a more immediate period of stress. If it's higher HRV above where it normally likes to be, or what your normal level is, then it's the other direction. It's coming back down from where it was. So it's just swinging back and forth. Again, I think the confusing things, the confounding things for people is they tend to just think of HRV as this workout tool or measurement, but it's not. It's measuring this output of everything. It's literally a reflection of what is your lifestyle doing to your body. Is the way to look at it. When you see big variations, it means that your lifestyle is causing a lot of stress in the body. Now, that's not necessarily a bad thing as long as it can recover from that and it's able to do it in a productive way. But if it's swinging all over the place, chances are it's not recovering from it. You do want, again, like I said, a fair amount of stability in that, but that really depends on the system that you're using. But yeah, it's not just workout equals hard equals low HRV. It doesn't work that way. There's just so many overlapping influences. You've got people are often shocked at how much alcohol impacts them, how much a poor night of sleep impacts them, how much a day of stress at work impacts them, how much, all of these things add up. They're cumulative. They're not separate individual buckets that you can quantify. They're all overlapping. They all impact the body because they're all impacting that autonomic nervous system, and they're all a form of stress in the body.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier there are a couple different ways to measure HRV as far as the calculation goes. And this kind of takes me back to my exercise science days. Could you, and I've seen more people talk about this as well.
Sure.
Could you explain what the RR interval is and why its measurement is crucial for HRV?
Sure. So again, if we're measuring its core, HRV is this measurement of the variability from one heartbeat to the next, right? So if your heart was like a metronome, then like I said, it would beat every second. If it was 60 beats per minute, it'd be very clear, but it's not. So we have to figure out, well, how do we actually measure the variability? And we have to basically have a way to delineate one heartbeat from the next. And the way we do that is what's called the RR interval. It's, if you were to look at an EKG, you would just see this R wave, and there's a peak of that R wave. And we say the difference between those R waves is one heartbeat. So you have to be able to measure that R to R interval accurately to figure out how much time there was from one heartbeat to the next. And we measure that in milliseconds or thousandths of a second. So we measure it very precisely, because if we can't measure it precisely, then we can't get the variability. And then this is not this huge variability. If we look at the grand scheme of things, it could be 30 milliseconds, 40 milliseconds, 60 milliseconds, 60 thousandths of a second is the average variability over the course of a measurement period. So it's not a massive amount of variability. It's fairly small, but it substantially changes, and that's what we're measuring. So if you don't get that measurement accurately, then your HRV isn't going to be an accurate reflection of what you wanted to measure. It's like if you stepped on the scale and you couldn't measure your pounds very accurately, you really wouldn't know how much your weight was changing. If your scale was only plus or minus 3 pounds in accuracy, would you have a very good gauge of what your weight was actually doing? Probably not. So we have to be able to measure HRV accurately by detecting that R wave, which is really important. And then we also have what are called ectopic beats. We get what are called artifacts in data. There's all sorts of things that happen as we measure that has to be taken accounted for and filtered. And there's all kinds of math and stuff behind that has to be done precisely and accurate as well. So there's lots of things that can influence it, and it is a sensitive measure. So again, you really have to make sure that whatever system you're using, you trust that they're doing this correctly, or you're going to get a number, but that number might not be very meaningful because it might not have measured what you were trying to measure accurately. You might have just got a lot of other things in there that didn't reflect what you wanted it to reflect.
Sure. So regardless of the calculation that you use, if the data is off, right, that interval, then it doesn't really matter. So
no, it doesn't matter. I mean, it's a sensitive metric. It changes. So, an easy example is measure your blood pressure 3 times in a row. Your blood pressure will not be the exact same 3 times in a row. Watch your heart rate bounce around. Your heart rate does not sit there in one place. The body is extremely dynamic, and HRV is very, very sensitive. It's measuring small changes. So if I just, I prefer to measure my HRV laying down, but you can also do it seated. It kind of depends on what your fitness level is and how much variability you have. But if I just sit up and then lay back down, it's going to take a minute probably for my heart rate and my HRV to stabilize before I can do it again. If I start talking, it's going to bounce all over the place. If I move my arms around as I measure, it's going to be all over the place. You've really got to be, especially if you're measuring it how I recommend, which is what I would call active measurements. You need to be very consistent. You need to be very still as much as possible and relax as you're measuring it to get a true reflection, because anything that causes your heart rate to elevate quickly or suddenly is going to drop your HRV significantly, because you're turning that stress response system on and you're then dropping your HRV artificially. You're just measuring what you just did. You're not measuring the response of what your body has done over the last day or two. So it's a very sensitive metric. It needs to be measured correctly, accurately, precisely. I would say not to have coffee, honestly, before you do that. That coffee is a sympathetic stressor and it will cause your heart rate. Anything that causes your heart rate to elevate is just going to reflect in the HRV that you just did something to cause your heart rate to elevate.
So basically I'm sitting up and I'm having coffee and I'm reading my emails. You're saying I should probably lie down and just chill.
I'm saying if you're doing that, you're not getting a good measurement. It needs to be very stabilized and it needs to be very consistent.
Okay.
If you're reading a paper, you might read something concerning, especially in today's news. If you really want to be, you can be seated or laying down, but you want to be the same position every day. You really want to avoid any sort of stimulant, coffee or supplement or whatever before you measure it. You don't want to be talking. You don't want to be moving around.
Definitely
it's a very sensitive metric. So the more relaxed and consistent you can measure it, the more accurately it's going to reflect not just what you're doing right now, but what your body's done the last, I said day or 2 or 3.
So definitely don't watch Celtic play soccer or football at the time.
No, you definitely don't want. I mean, it's really simple. Look at your heart rate and watch how much your heart rate bounces around. You want that heart rate bouncing around just as a result of the autonomic nervous system, not as a result of what you are doing. And if you're watching TV, if someone comes to the room and is talking to you, if you're moving your body around to try to get more comfortable, all those things are just tanking HRV, because your body's responding to those things by dropping HRV and producing more energy and responding to that. You really just want to eliminate the external environment influences as much as possible, because otherwise you're just measuring the responses to those things and not your body's everything else.
Yeah. So what you just talked through is the difference between active versus passive HRV measurements. Is that, just to make sure I'm getting that, or is that something different?
Yeah. So what I'm talking about is a lot of wearables now, they just measure HRV overnight. And I would call that passive, because you're not having to sit there and take an actual measurement. You're just sitting there going to sleep. In the background, it happens, you wake up, you have a score. That's passive. Active is where we initiate a test and we measure it at a particular point in time over, whatever time frame the system you're using asks you to do. Morpheus is 2.5 minutes. Different systems can have different times. But there are pros and cons. I would say the biggest problem there's a lot of problems with overnight HRV, which it's obviously the biggest pro for overnight HRV is it's more convenient. I don't have to do anything. I don't have to remember to measure it in the morning. I can just sit back and get a number. The problem is all these years of research, decades of research, has been done largely through active measurements, because what we really want to see is where did your body end up after going through the day yesterday and a full period of sleep? Where are you at right now each morning to start the day? Because that helps us drive decisions. We can only really get that number if we measure first thing in the morning after we've completed the sleep cycle. When we're just taking averages, because what most of these systems now are doing is just taking measurements for little snippets of time overnight, and then they're averaging them. Well, mostly what they're measuring is what we should average over the 6 or 8 hour period. That's a good reflection of sleep quality to some extent. But does that tell us where our bodies ended that period? No, it just tells us where our average was across a 6-8 hour period. It doesn't tell us the end result. The other thing is, if you did work out, or if you did have a couple glasses of wine, or if you did do something in the evening times before you went to bed, then the first few hours of your sleep cycle are just reflecting that. And we're not seeing true HRV. We're just seeing its response to those last few hours. So you're not getting a true picture of what your actual sleep average really was. You're just seeing a few hours of the body's sleep being impacted by the things you did in the evening time. So we're not seeing this true cycle. What I really want to see to make a decision is, where's my body at right now? And then make decisions based on that. But if I'm only seeing the average of where it was when it was sleeping, it's not really giving me this big picture of how did my body recover? How did that sleep period impact my body? Because seeing where you ended up is very different than seeing where your average was over the previous number of hours. So I think there's just, again, it's convenient, but there's a reason the research is not done that way. And there's a reason the research is always done 99% of the time with these active measurements, because we want to have a more dynamic picture of where you are right now when you're waking, not what you averaged over some period of time, a few hours as you were sleeping. It's just not an accurate reflection of how this process is played out of stress and recovery across the body.
Can the devices we wear, so let's say the Apple Watch, right? That's super common that people are wearing. Can that do an active measurement?
They can, yes. The Breathe app. So they have a Breathe app that measures, they can basically create an active measurement. You just go into the setting and go into the Apple Watch and just do the Breathe test or Breathe part of the feature, and it will allow you to measure it. Now, again, Apple's measuring what's called SDNN. I don't know why they chose that one. It's much, it's kind of an older metric that was used to measure your averages over long periods of time. And it was kind of this general wellness that was used in medical circles quite a while ago, but it really isn't used for much anymore. So I don't know why they chose that one. It doesn't move as much because it's a different way of measuring, different calculation. But yeah, you can still do it. I would say that whatever system that you use, the most important thing is to understand what's a normal amount of change for you. Like maybe on one system, you change an average of 2 to 3 points, and that's pretty normal for you. Well, when you're changing 4, 5, 6 points, that's less normal for you. It means your body's under more and more stress. So whatever system you're using, you want to kind of find these patterns of what's a normal thing for you in a normal amount of stress, a normal week, and all these things, and what's not so normal, which indicates your body's under much more than average stress. And then also just looking at how much it changes over time and what it's doing. If it's trending up, that's generally a good thing. If it's trending down, that's generally a bad thing. And that's consistent across any system. You don't really want to trend down. There's no advantages to dropping your HRV over time. That generally means your body's not coping with the stress very well. And there's advantages seeing it trend up over time. That means your body's improving its capacity, it's improving its aerobic function, and it's getting better at all this sort of stuff. So you can look at the trends as well. But again, that's really specific to the system, what a normal change over time might be.
So Joel, let's just try pull some of this together, because you've obviously mentioned quite a bit there. So for our listeners, let's just go 1 and 1 makes 2. So how do factors like stress, exercise, and rest influence my HRV readings?
So again, 2 variables here. We're talking about short term. All those things are going to cause a temporary decrease, followed by an increase, potentially back above where it started, and then it'll all kind of play out. So it's just going through these cycles. Different types of stressors will cause those different reactions. Lack of sleep, alcohol and stimulants, working out, those are all going to suppress your HRV. But your HRV should come back to where it was and end up going through this process over and over again. Over the long run, if we want to increase our HRV, we have to increase our aerobic fitness. It's the single biggest thing that we can drive an increase in our average. And just like everything else in fitness, there are genetic components to HRV. So some people can have very high HRV, they have very high levels of aerobic fitness. They just are naturally and genetically more inclined to have higher HRV numbers. Some people have much lower HRV. They just genetically don't have the same capacity to turn that system up as much. They don't have the same range and all that sort of thing. So again, we can build our HRV by being healthy, obviously, but our number one thing that's going to drive a long-term increase in average is the aerobic fitness system. You build the aerobic side of things, you build more mitochondria, you generally will see an increase in the average HRV. But again, there are genetic influences at play here. Not everyone can develop it to the same extent as anyone else or everyone else just because of individual differences. But that's the big picture. It really depends on the context.
So let's pick up on the comment that you made. You said that an increase in HRV isn't always a straightforward sign of recovery. So can you then expand on how people should interpret the fluctuations in their HRV readings?
Look, the biggest thing is you don't have to pay as much attention as you don't have to get a microscope out and look at every little detail of it. Is it up or is it down? Is it here? Is it there? It's really just two things. Am I trending up, trending down, or kind of staying about the same? Like if I look at the weekly picture, I just want to see where am I heading. If my weekly picture is like my numbers are going down across the week and I'm consistently not at least maintaining it, it means my body's under too much stress. If it's consistently trending up, it means I'm probably improving my aerobic, my cardiovascular side. I'm becoming better at this sort of stuff. My body's becoming better at activating that parasympathetic nervous system. That is a good thing. So if I look at a weekly picture, that tells me a lot of information. On a daily picture, it's more about just how much am I changing? Am I having these huge swings from one day to the next? Or am I somewhat consistent in my numbers? Consistency, stability is generally speaking going to be a better thing, and it's going to be more likely to lead to those weekly or longer term increases. If I see a lot of instability and my HRV is just bouncing everywhere every day, it tells me that my body's under a lot of stress that's not responding particularly well to. So I wouldn't worry too much about directionality on a given day. I would just look at how much is it changing and how much is it changing relative to what feels normal to me. I would then look again more at that long-term picture. Am I going up? Am I staying about the same, or am I going down? If I'm going down, that's a bad thing. If I'm staying the same, it means it's just not really changing one way or the other. If I'm going up on an average over time, that's a good thing. So again, you really kind of have to have these two different contexts, these two different lenses you look at through. And you shouldn't worry as much about is it up or is it down on a daily basis. Just look at where is it, how much is it jumping around, and then look at where is it up or down on the bigger scale.
So I think for summary, most people out there, an ideal scenario would be do your HRV in the morning laying down every morning, focus more on weekly numbers for consistency, but then trending over time, maybe on a monthly or some sort of longer term period, we want to see that slowing going up. Is that how most people should think about HRV, just to help them in their daily life?
I mean, you can also see trending on short periods. If I look at the last 7 days and I look at my numbers and they can trend down, you don't have to see that only on a month. If you trend down for 2 or 3 weeks, obviously the month is going to trend down, but you can look at trends at least on a weekly basis. You'll see these trends on that kind of 7-day cycle. Most people operate pretty cleanly on a weekly basis, right? They work through the week and they have the weekends, they function differently, and they come back to work on Monday. For the most part, you see these weekly patterns of working out and stress from work and sleep cycles and diet. And so it is valuable to just look at this weekly pattern. Am I trending the right direction on a weekly basis, which just accumulates over time to be my monthly basis? So I do think you want to look at trends over shorter periods of time than just months, but you can look at it weeks. And then I'll also say not every system out there allows you to measure actively. A lot of the systems that are being worn, the URAs and the WHOOPs, you have no control over that. You can only let it work overnight. There is no capacity to measure at one particular point in time in the morning. And that's why I don't like those systems as much, because you don't have any real control over it. You can't say, hey, I want to measure each morning to get my readiness for that particular day. It's only going to give you a score when you wake up, and that's it. And so, if you really want to have a better reflection of where I'm at right now to help you judge that day, then you want an active system like Morpheus or any other one that allows you to consistently measure it when you want to measure it and have total control over what you're doing with it.
Yeah. And when you say judge that day, would you say that you can use your HRV to predict maybe how you should work out for that day, how you should treat your body? Or is it more of, yeah, it's helpful, but it's not really that impactful?
No, look, I think people always get this idea of it's telling you what you can do as it's like setting a limit, but it can't predict what your body is capable of. Your body is capable of doing a lot of things in a lot of different conditions. It is more of a reflection, like you just mentioned, of what your body, you probably should do if your goal is to have this long-term increase or at least prevent a decrease. If I'm consistently outside my normal HRV, it doesn't mean I can't work out hard today. It just means I'm going to pay a bigger cost for that if I do. I'm going to dig myself a bigger hole. If I'm already in a hole and then I dig another bit down, I'm just in a deeper hole. It's the same thing. If my recovery is already suffering and I'm already kind of going through the effects of what I did the last day or two, and my body has not come back to normal, and then I just go into another hard workout or I do something else that's very stressful, it just takes me even longer to get back to baseline. So it's just telling me, like, if you do a harder workout, then there's just a greater cost to pay for that than if you'd started from the ground level versus in a hole to begin with, if that makes sense. So it's never telling you like, oh, if you go in the gym everything's going to feel heavy and you can't run very fast, or if you go play in a game, you're going to get injured. It never predicts human performance or predicts what you're going to do when you go work out or do something stressful. It's really just helping you understand what's the cost of that going to be. And then you can make your own decisions accordingly based on that.
So one of the things I like to do as I've got older is I like to see what happens on a month to month rather than a day to day.
Sure.
And one of the things I do is I do this 10-mile bike challenge. And I do it on the first day with a bunch of my friends. And it's not about us beating each other. It's about beating ourselves plus or minus in terms of, and it's time for 10 miles. When I do that, I constantly look at my heart rate, and I'll look at my heart rate. Now, what's interesting, since I've been looking at my HRV, on the days when I've been told that my readiness score is not great, I've intentionally kept my heart rate low as a result of that. So if I'm looking at my training and my recovery, should I focus on the heart rate variability, the heart rate, or both? What should I do?
I mean, for readiness, it's heart rate variability. Well, look, let me put it this way. You also have to understand heart rate variability is a physiological measurement. We are measuring something in your body. Same thing with heart rate. We are measuring the number of times your heart rate beats per minute. Readiness, recovery, any sort of gauge like that, it's created by the company that made it. It's an algorithm. It's a formulation that company or that group invented. And Morpheus is the same way. We have a recovery score. It's what I created after looking at lots and lots of data and coaching for many, many years to understand how I would make decisions for that individual. But you're leaving, again, that company may have did a really good algorithm that correlates and is valuable, or may have just made shit up out of thin air because they could. So you have to be very cognizant of how accurate is that information and what do you want to do with it. But in general, a lot of variability in the days leading up to something is going to be a lower level of however you want to define it, recovery or readiness or whatever. Your HRVs are pretty stable. You're in your normal ranges. Your recovery or readiness or whatever is probably pretty decent. And then the heart rates in the workout will also reflect that. So if I do a normal workout and my heart rates are far different than they normally are, that is another indication my body's been under a lot of stress lately. If my heart rates are kind of where they normally are, that means I've probably been under less stress. So I don't think you want to ever, I don't know what's the word, coach by numbers and just rely purely on a number on a system as the sole decision maker for you. You want to take into account the bigger picture. How do you feel? What are your numbers been doing over the longer term? What are your actual performance been in the last few days? How sore are you?
Where
all
are
those
you
things.
in your training cycle?
Where are you in training cycle? Exactly. If it's a Friday, my decision, and I know I have 2 days off, my decision is probably different than if it's a Tuesday, even if I have the same numbers on HRV, because I know I have 2 days off afterwards. So this is all just information I think you want to use to make these sorts of decisions. I don't think you want to ever just look at one number on a screen and let your entire training depend on that one number. Again, was it even measured accurately? There's lots of variables there. So these are all just things to help you make decisions. They don't make decisions for you. I think they're just ways to learn how your body reacts. They're things to help you make more informed decisions than just guessing. It's feedback to see what happens after you did. So again, you can learn your body's response, but you never want to just replace, the whole decision-making process with what's the number on the screen. Okay, I'm going to then do this. There's more to it than that.
Okay, well, let's take that further then. So I think I mentioned to you, one of the things I'm looking at is more longer-term fitness trends than just looking on a day-to-day basis. So are there any long-term fitness trends that can be discerned from HRV? Sure.
Like I said, like I mentioned earlier, average HRV will correlate very well with VO2 max, which we would define as, a kind of gold standard marker of aerobic fitness, which will also correlate with resting heart rate, which falls the same category. Heart rate recovery, how quickly your heart rate can drop after various periods of intense work, is going to correlate as well. So as your aerobic fitness increases, you're generally most often going to see a decrease in in resting heart rate, or decrease in resting heart rate, increase in average HRV. Those things will all line up. So your performances in your time trials, if you see those numbers improve over time, chances are you also saw your resting heart rate drop and your average HRV increase a little bit. Now, the higher up you go in the fitness scale, the smaller those changes are and the longer they take to reflect, but that's just the normal process. An elite athlete might spend an entire year to have a 2% increase in, some of these metrics. Someone who's just starting out can double those metrics in, 3 months because they have so much more room to improve. But again, It's the same thing. I wouldn't only look at HRV as a marker of fitness change. I would look at a time trial like you're doing. I would look at any sort of VO2 max measurements I'm doing. I would look at their heart rates at a given speed. I would look at their power output at that given heart rate. I would look at heart rate recovery, right? You want to look at all the actual output numbers of what you're doing. That's going to be the best gauge of what your fitness level is. What can you actually do with it?
Mhm.
So Joel, let's just assume that the system I'm using is accurate and that you believe in it. Obviously, I told you I had an ablation last year. My resting heart rate as a result of that ablation went up 10 beats a minute. So I can no longer hit the times that I was hitting prior to that. Would that have meant that my HRV would have done the same?
I mean, your HRV probably went down a bit. Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, did you measure it before and after? You haven't measured. You didn't measure it before.
Well, no, it's one of those things. HRV is new to me, and as a result of having this, I obviously started looking into more data, and I only started doing my HRV after the ablation, so I didn't know it before.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, chances are, if your resting heart rate went up by 10 beats, your HRV probably dropped a bit. But again, it doesn't mean that you can't improve it. It doesn't mean that using it's not valuable. It just means you kind of reset where your baseline is based on what you had done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But
So
still,
we've been talking about
don't let it decrease. That's what you want to do. Cardiovascular
Yeah.
health is really important, obviously, for a wide number of reasons. Decreasing HRV is generally a bad sign. So even if you don't get it to increase, you want it to decrease as little as possible as you age. You want to slow that process down, because
I'm trying.
aging is really
I promise
aging
I'm
is just a
trying,
loss
Joel.
of adaptability. So don't let
Yeah.
it go down, or keep it from
Yeah.
going down as much as possible.
We've talked about Morpheus a little bit throughout this episode. And I want to dive deeper into, what it is and what makes it different a little bit right now. So could you walk us through Morpheus and what it is, what makes it different? And can you use it with any kind of strap? Is it an app? Just talk us through it.
Sure. Morpheus is a combination of hardware and software. So we have our own app, Train with Morpheus. And Morpheus does something that I think is really valuable, in that it takes your HRV and your lifestyle metrics, and it helps then turn that into a workout for you that makes more sense. So what it does is, we have a chest strap. You can measure HRV with our chest strap only, but you can use any other wearable to get sleep, to get activity. And even if you want to work out with any other devices, you can work out with them. So once you've measured your HRV, we give you two things. We give you a recovery score like we've talked about, but more than that, we give you heart rate zones for the day that represent your level of intensity. So we give you a low intensity zone, which is your blue zone, a moderate intensity zone, which is your green zone, and a high intensity zone, which is your red zone. And unlike every other system out there, that these zones are always the same, they're just based on static percentage of max heart rate. We adjust those heart rate zones based on your recovery and your HRV changes, because they represent different levels of intensity based on that. And what I mean by that is, if I lift weights and I'm very fatigued, 80% of my 1 rep max might feel very heavy on one day. If I'm well recovered, 80% of my 1 rep max might feel very light on another day. The same weight can feel different to us because of our previous fatigue and previous recovery. It's the same thing with heart rates. If I'm very fatigued, a given speed and a given heart rate, it's a much higher level of intensity than if I'm well recovered. So we have adjustable heart rate zones, so we're able to personalize that intensity on a daily basis. But then more than that, what we did is we looked at 500,000 plus workouts over a long period of time with our clients and people using Morpheus. And we figured out how much time do people spend in these different zones that see improvements in their aerobic fitness, which we looked at through average HRV and decreases in resting heart rate. And we figured out different percentages that people spend in different levels of intensity. And so we give you this weekly marker of how much time you want to spend in each one of those heart rate zones if your goal is to increase your fitness and your aerobic capacity. So for example, it might say, hey, your low intensity zone 1, you need 100 to 150 minutes this week. Zone 2, our zone 2 at least, you need, let's say 20 to 30 minutes per week. Our zone 3, let's say you might need 5 to 10 minutes this week. And so it tells you basically how much time you should spend in different levels of intensity to see your fitness improve. And then of course it measures your recovery. It looks at what you did, looks at your sleep, your HRV, all these sorts of things. And then it adjusts that the following week. And so it's trying to take the data you have and provide a roadmap for how much training you should do and how hard that training should be if your goal is to improve your aerobic fitness. So if you say, hey, I really want to increase my VO2 max, I really want to increase my average HRV, well, we can provide a roadmap of how many minutes you should spend each week in these different levels of intensity to do that. And then we also have 12 different interval methods and steady state methods built into the app that will guide you throughout that process. So for example, if you say I want to do what's called zone 2 now, today's steady state cardio, well, we'll tell you exactly what your heart rates need to be on each and every day to hit that particular level of intensity. If you want to do different types of interval training that I've used over the years as a coach, we have different types of intervals that are built into the app that'll guide you through those intervals. So if you say I need X number of minutes in my green zone today, which is my moderate intensity zone, we have different green zone intervals to help you get those minutes. If you want to get your heart rate up in the highest intensity zones, our red zone, we have different intervals that help you drive your heart rate up into that red zone. So again, the whole point with Morpheus when I built it was I want to take the data, which is really valuable, and help people translate that into what do I actually do? And the most important things to know is how much should I train this week and how hard should it be? Those are the fundamental questions you have to answer. And Morpheus provides guidance for that because, again, it's telling you how many minutes in each of your heart rate zones. How much should I do? How hard should it be? That's what Morpheus allows you to see. And it's really the only system out there that does that.
Okay. And then can you use any monitor? Or I'm guessing I know the answer to this question based off of everything we talked about before with how different calculations are. But can I use my Polar or anything I already have or no?
So you can use any device you want to work out with Morpheus, but to measure HRV and to get these personalized zones and get all this stuff dialed in, you need to wear our chest strap to measure HRV so that we know that it's measured accurately and with our own algorithm and everything else. Once you have that information, you can use whatever heart rate monitor you want to actually do a workout. So if you love your Polar or you love your Garmin or you love whatever, you can work out any Bluetooth device that connects to the Morpheus app you can use. And actually you can download Morpheus for free and you can still train with it. You just won't get that level of personalization unless you use our chest strap to measure your recovery each day or your HRV and get that recovery score. But you can still actually, right now, you can go to Train with Morpheus on the store. You could download it. You could use a Polar or a Garmin. You could measure your workouts. You could get your heart rate zones. They just won't be specific and individualized, and we won't give those weekly recommendations. So it's very flexible in the sense that if you have a heart rate monitor you love working out with, work out with it all you want to. You really just need to use a Morpheus strap to get the HRV each day and do it so we know that it's accurate and that's going to then give you the best information possible.
Okay. So let's summarize a little bit. So could you share maybe your top 3 rules or non-negotiables for anyone looking to use HRV to enhance health and human performance?
Sure. I mean, look, number one is you have to get accurate measurements. Okay. If you're measuring in the background where you're getting on your phone, you're watching TV, it's not going to be accurate. So make sure you're doing it consistently, actively, same time of day without interference. Again, you want to minimize any distractions or noise. It really needs to be as accurate as possible. And the more ways you can do that by minimizing changes from day to day, the better. That's number one. Just make sure your daily measurements accurately. Number two is consistency really, really matters. If you're only getting 2 days per week, it's really hard to make much sense of it because you're just seeing very incomplete, pictures of your weekly schedule and your weekly stress levels. So if you can do it every day, that by far is what you should do. I would say a minimum about 4 days per week is what's going to be needed to really get a good understanding of what your body is doing and what's normal and what's less normal and abnormal and all those sorts of things. So accuracy and consistency are really the most important things. And then the third thing I would say, which is probably not something most people tell you, is it really helps you make sense of HRV if you have some kind of journal or log or training history or some way to keep track of what you're doing. Because a lot of times people won't know what the numbers reflect if they didn't pay attention to what they were doing. Well, maybe you forgot you had, I'm just using alcohol, maybe you forgot you had 3 glasses of wine 3 nights ago and it still impacted your sleep, which impacted 2 days later. So it's really important if you want to learn how your body is reacting to these things to keep some sort of track of it. I'm not saying you have to micromanage every day, but a training journal, a daily journal where you keep track of what you did in some macro basis is really, really helpful for looking back and seeing what was happening to cause your HRV to go up over time. Because I've seen people have big changes in HRV, both positive and negative, and they couldn't figure out why. It's because they didn't have any idea what they were doing. They were just kind of going about their life without any sort of semblance of connecting those dots. And so if you can have any way to just take a minute each day, write down a few core things, what your workout was, how hard it was, any differences in your diet, or anything that might have influenced that, you can start to connect those dots a lot between your lifestyle and your data, and that helps you make much more informed decisions. So keeping those two things connected is really important for, again, optimizing and making better decisions as you go. If you do those 3 things, you measure accurately, you measure consistently, and you keep a record of some sense of what your life is like on a daily basis, it just helps you use the HRV information as much as you possibly can to get the most out of it.
So Joel, just on your Morpheus test, how long does that take me every day?
So the test itself is 2.5 minutes, but it's going to allow you. So when you start it, it's going to make sure that your heart rate is as stable as possible. That you're not moving around and you're not doing something that's going to cause an inaccurate reading. To stabilize your heart rate could take 30 seconds or it could take a couple minutes depending on what you're doing. But the whole process shouldn't take more than 5 minutes. That's a pretty safe bet, is no more than 5 minutes.
It's interesting you said 2.5 minutes, because the system I'm using does 2.5 minutes too. Is there something around 2.5 minutes that just makes it more accurate for you?
Yeah, there's research around 2.5 minutes. Part of it is some of the calculations that you do for HRV required 2.5 minutes, so it kind of just became a standard.
Got it.
And also, I would say the shorter term, it's possible to get accurate data with shorter measurements. There's research showing 60 seconds is fine, but it creates very little margin for error. You have to be really locked in for those 60 seconds and have a really, perfectly controlled scenario to get really good data in 60 seconds. A longer measurement gets you a little bit more wiggle room. If you moved around for a few seconds, you didn't shoot the whole test in the foot because it was only a few seconds. If it was 15 seconds of a 60-second test, 25% of your data could be junk. If it was 15 seconds at 2.5 minutes, it's less of a big deal. So I would say, generally speaking, you want to find enough time where we have enough accurate data, but where you're not forcing someone to sit there for 10 minutes and be bored out of their mind and get distracted just from sitting there for too long. So that 2.5 minutes seems to be about the right window. And again, because of the calculation required, that's just kind of where a lot of them fall.
Very interesting. Well, this has been fascinating for me, really, really interesting for me for lots of reasons. And as we come to the end of the podcast, you're probably aware the aim of our podcast and the theme of our podcast is strength, kindness, and perspective. You've told us a lot about the strength of HRV. You've given us a huge perspective and a lot of great education around it. In terms of kindness, is there someone out there you'd like to give a shout to? Someone that's been a mentor, someone you just want to give a leg up to? Is there someone you want to show kindness to, please?
Look, I think my first mentor, a guy named Bill Gillespie, deserves a huge amount of credit for helping build my career to what it has become, because he was, at the time I was just undergrad at University of Washington, he was the head strength conditioning coach at University of Washington football program. He was, I think it must have been late 40s. I was some 20-year-old kid, and I had just been studying everything I could about strength conditioning because I was so passionate about it. And I just shot him an email one day and said, "Hey, I'd love to come down and talk shop and help out in any way that I can." And rather than just kind of blowing me off as a 20-year-old kid who didn't know what he didn't know, he said, "Sure, come on down." And I started having daily talks with him about different areas of strength conditioning. We started working out together. I interned in the weight room with them, and he basically just took me under his wing and allowed me to, really see the possibilities for my career. And again, he was probably trained people for longer than I'd been alive. He was a multiple world champion, a world record holder in powerlifting. He's done 1,000-pound bench press now in his 60s, which is insane.
Wow.
But as someone who is so experienced at that point in his life, for you to just listen to this 20-year-old kid shoot ideas off and bounce ideas off your head and allow him to come down and hang out and be part of the weight room and intern there was really what got me started. And he didn't have to do that. Like, I think it's easy to dismiss people that have so much less experience than you and are in a very different place, but he didn't. So I've always kept that in mind when I get people reaching out to me as young coaches asking for advice or asking questions on whatever. And I think just being open to helping the younger generation and people that are obviously, at a much different point, just starting, I think that's hugely valuable. And I can't thank Bill enough for doing that.
Just quickly before you sign off, don't forget to visit network.allwellco.com and join our professional network. You'll get to enjoy exclusive benefits from brands we love and have access to a community where learning and professional development are always at the forefront of everything we do.